Welcome to Echo No More, clear, credible, court-ready documentation in high-conflict parenting. No hype, no legal jargon, no drama. I'm Dr. James. If you're new here, I'm really glad you found this space. This podcast is for protective parents navigating high-conflict custody situations, especially when the other parent is manipulative, emotionally unsafe, or unpredictable. I'm not a lawyer, and this podcast isn't legal advice. What I am is a parent who has lived through this system, and someone whose attorneys over and over again told me the same thing. Your documentation is excellent. They told me it made their job easier. They told me it protected my credibility. And they told me it changed how my case was received. That's why I'm sharing this. Not to teach you how to fight, but how to document calmly, clearly, and in a way courts actually understand. This is parent to parent, calm, grounded, and focused on protecting your child without losing yourself. This episode is one that can feel uncomfortable, not because parents are doing something wrong, but because the system often misunderstands why they're doing it. Most protective parents are not trying to control anything, they are trying to prevent harm. But here's the difficult reality. Courts don't assess intent, they assess impact. And sometimes, behaviors that come from protection can be interpreted as control, especially when documentation isn't framed carefully. I want to start by saying something very clearly. Protective parents often increase structure, oversight, and boundaries in response to instability. That's not manipulation, that's adaptation. But adaptation can look suspicious to courts if it's not documented thoughtfully. Protection and control are not defined by how much you do. They are defined by why and how you do it. Protection is responsive. Control is directive. Protection reacts to observed need. Control imposes regardless of context. Protection adjusts when conditions change. Control stays rigid. Courts watch for these differences closely, often without naming them. And honestly, this is where many deeply caring parents become frightened, because they know internally that they are trying to protect their child, but somewhere along the way they begin realizing the system may not automatically see it that way. That realization can create enormous anxiety. Parents begin second-guessing every decision. Should I intervene? Should I document this? Should I set this boundary? Will this look controlling? Will this be misunderstood? And that fear can become paralyzing, especially for parents who have already experienced being minimized, dismissed, or accused of overreacting. So, I want to slow this down carefully, because the distinction between protection and control is often less about the existence of a boundary and more about whether the boundary appears connected to observable reality. This is where documentation plays a critical role. If documentation shows that your actions follow observable patterns, concerns, or professional recommendations, it reads as protection. If documentation shows that actions are imposed without explanation, flexibility, or clear trigger, courts may read it as control, even if that's not what it is. This is not fair, but it is real. For example, when a parent limits communication, supervision, or access, courts want to know what prompted that change. Not emotionally, chronologically. What happened before the boundary was introduced? What changed after? Was the boundary adjusted over time? These questions matter more than how strongly you felt. And that can feel invalidating for parents living inside chronic stress. Because when you are carrying fear every day, your nervous system often wants the intensity of your emotion to communicate the seriousness of the concern. But courts generally respond more to structure than intensity. That doesn't mean your fear is irrational. It means legal systems evaluate patterns differently than nervous systems do. Another place parents get tripped up is over-documentation of rules. When documentation becomes a list of restrictions rather than a record of observations, it can unintentionally signal control. But when documentation shows concerns arising, steps taken, outcomes observed, adjustments made, the narrative shifts. Now it's not this parent is restrictive, it's this parent is responding. That difference is subtle and powerful, and honestly, responsive parents usually look different on paper than controlling parents. Responsive parents tend to adjust over time, describe context, note what changed, show attempts at collaboration, reassess when circumstances improve. Controlling dynamics tend to look rigid, regardless of changing conditions. That distinction matters more than many parents realize. I also want to talk to you about fear, because fear drives a lot of protective behavior. When we as parents are afraid, then we often tighten. We document more, we intervene sooner, we explain less. That tightening makes sense emotionally, but on paper it can read as rigidity. Documentation that includes reflection and recalibration counters that. You don't need to justify yourself endlessly. You just need to show that your actions are not static. Another place protection gets mistaken for control is when parents try to prevent emotional harm proactively. For example, shielding a child from conflict, information, or stress. Courts value emotional protection, but they are cautious when it appears unilateral or absolute. Documentation that shows awareness of the child's developmental needs, flexibility, and willingness to reassess reads as protective. Documentation that reads like permanent restriction without context can raise questions. This doesn't mean you stop protecting your child. It means you document your reasoning, not just the action. And I think this is where many parents unintentionally get lost. Because under stress, people naturally focus on the action, the rule, the restriction, the intervention. But documentation becomes stronger when it also captures why now, why this response, what changed, what concern triggered this. Sequence matters, timing matters, proportionality matters. Another important distinction is this: protection centers the child, control centers the system. When documentation stays focused on how the child is functioning, responding, or recovering, it aligns with protection. When documentation focuses heavily on enforcing compliance or monitoring behavior without reference to child impact, it risks being misread. Again, this is about framing, not morality. Most parents are protecting because they care deeply. Courts don't question caring, they question proportionality. Is the response proportional to the concern? Documentation helps answer that question. And proportionality is not about perfection. It's about whether your response appears connected to observable circumstances. For example, did the intervention increase after a concerning event? Did it decrease when stability improved? Was flexibility ever attempted? Were alternatives considered? Those details communicate responsiveness. One of the most powerful things you can do is show restraint. Not absence of action, restraint in tone. When documentation reflects measured decisions, calm boundaries, ongoing assessment, it signals maturity. And maturity is something courts trust. This is important because many parents believe they need to sound more alarmed in order to be taken seriously. But heightened emotional language can sometimes obscure otherwise legitimate concerns. Calm documentation allows the pattern itself to carry weight, and over time, patterns are often more persuasive than emotionally forceful entries. Another thing I want parents to understand is that healthy protection leaves room for change. That matters enormously. Protective parenting is not about creating permanent emergency conditions. It's about responding to the child's needs as those needs evolve, which means sometimes you tighten boundaries, sometimes you loosen them, sometimes you pause, sometimes you reassess. That flexibility communicates attunement, and attunement is very different from control. Control seeks certainty. Protection seeks safety. Those are not the same thing. I also want to say something that many parents need permission to hear. You are allowed to change your approach. If something didn't work, adjusting does not mean you were wrong. It means you are responsive. Documentation that shows learning and adjustment reads as protection, not control. Control resists change. Protection adapts. That distinction matters deeply. And honestly, one of the strongest indicators of healthy protective parenting is the ability to tolerate reassessment. To say, this boundary was necessary then, or this approach no longer seems necessary now. That does not weaken your credibility, it often strengthens it. Because rigid certainty can read as agenda-driven. Responsive adjustment reads as child-centered. Finally, I want to address the fear beneath all of this. Parents worry, if I ease up, something bad will happen. That fear is real, especially for parents who have already witnessed instability, emotional harm, dysregulation, or repeated unpredictability. The nervous system naturally wants to prevent future pain. And prevention can sometimes slowly become hypervigilance without the parent even realizing it. That does not make you a bad parent. It makes you a scared one. But fear-based rigidity can eventually exhaust both parents and children. Protection does not require constant tightening. It requires attunement. Documentation that reflects attunement, noticing, responding, reassessing, protects you legally and emotionally. You do not need to document yourself as perfect. You do not need to prove that every fear was correct. You do not need to eliminate all uncertainty before making reasonable decisions. You simply need to show awareness, responsiveness, proportionality, flexibility, and child-centered reasoning. That is what protection tends to look like over time. Not perfection, not control, not constant escalation, just thoughtful responsiveness. You don't need to be perfect. You need to be reasonable, responsive, and regulated. That's what courts trust. Before we close, I want to remind you of something important. You don't need to document everything. You don't need to be perfect. And you don't need to convince anyone with emotion. Calm documentation is power. If this episode helped you, you will find a full structured system in my guide, Clear, Credible, Court Ready. It's designed to support, not replace, your attorney. And if you want help turning everything you're documenting into something organized and usable, you can visit www.echonomorecoaching.org to download my guide on how to create a clear, court-ready documentation binder. Take what helps, leave what doesn't, and most of all, take care of yourself. I'll see you next week.